Far away out past the moon came a little pink friend all alone. There's a house with a girl inside, such a nice and to his bride. Katie sees a friend in need, or me. It's Katie and Orby, and here's a bunch of stories about Katie and Orby and all the things they do. Katie's friend Orby now has a brand new family who teach him that people all have some good inside. Fly a kite, find a snake, camp outside or learn to skate. Build a snowman with your friend Orby. Fly a kite, find a snake, camp outside or learn to skate. Build a snowman with your friend Orby. Adventure and playtime should always last a lifetime, and with friends like Orby, the fun is guaranteed. So Katie and Orby are ready with their stories, playing and learning from all the things they do. As the sun begins each day, our new friend is here to stay.
It had been a day of figuring out. Katie learned that when peas roll off the table, they only drop down. Orby discovered that bubbles float up in a glass of water. And they both found out that a tiny dot of food coloring could turn the water bright blue. Dad told them that everything they were discovering today was science. Katie didn't know what a science was. Dad told her that he had a wonderful way to show her. He would take them to the Science Museum. And Dad told the two friends it was a place where they would discover some really interesting scientific things. In a flash, Katie and Orby were rushing to the car, with Dad racing out behind them. In the car, both Katie and Orby strained on their seatbelts to see if they were there yet. Dad told them that it was science that taught car makers that seatbelts were important. Katie and Orby looked at each other. They didn't understand. Dad explained that when cars stop suddenly, the people in them keep going forward and bump their heads. That was because of momentum. The speed they were traveling and the weight of their bodies made them keep going. Katie really didn't understand, and Orby wasn't sure that he did either. Dad just smiled and told them it was science. It wasn't long before their car turned into the big parking lot of the museum. Orby tooted and unclipped his belt as soon as Dad stopped. A huge rocket was sitting in the field near the museum. Orby burbled with joy. Dad told Orby that it was a rocket that had traveled to the moon. Well, now, Orby was really excited. He loved everything that had to do with outer space. Dad explained that it was because of science that people had flown up into space. Katie was still confused. She didn't quite understand what Dad was talking about. But Orby was starting to feel like he did. Once they handed in their tickets, Katie and Orby held tight to Dad's hand and walked into the darkened museum. It was dark. There in front of them was a case with the stars, the sun, the moon, and the planets all spinning around. Dad pointed out Earth and told them, in fact, they were on that planet right now. Katie knew about the Earth, and she started to feel like maybe she could understand science after all. Next, Dad took them to a crazy kitchen. The floor was on a slant, and you had to walk across it. That seemed easy enough. Dad told them that everything they were discovering today was science. Dad went around to wait on the other side of the kitchen. Katie and Orby entered, and right away, they knew something was wrong. It made them feel a bit seasick and a bit dizzy. Katie found it hard to keep her balance, and Orby hung onto the rail to get across the floor. And when you thought you were walking up, you were actually walking down. And they both laughed. It did really seem silly that you couldn't walk across the floor easily. And Dad explained that down wasn't where it looks in a crooked kitchen. And when they came out, they ended up by a collection of huge tubes and bicycles, and lights were flashing. And Katie told Orby, science sure was fun. First, they tried to see how electricity worked. Inside a tube, there were two metal rods. When you pushed a button, you could see a bright electrical current travel up between the two metal rods and make a big arc at the top. Dad told Katie and Orby that was how light bulbs worked. Katie was very impressed that a scientist would think of that. Next, they came to a row of lights that led down to something that looked like a bicycle. The bicycle didn't move, but if you pedaled, you could produce energy that lit up the light bulbs. Katie pedaled first, and she lit up 2 light bulbs. Orby pedaled second, and he lit up 3. Dad told them that it took a lot of power to light them all, and he would do his best. Soon, Dad was pedaling as fast as he could, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 lights all lit up. Katie and Orby both cheered. His energy was turning into electricity, and it was lighting the lights. When Dad stopped pedaling, the lights went out. Katie and Orby wanted to discover more science. They both grabbed Dad's hands and pulled him around the corner. Orby stopped in his tracks. Right in front of him was the inside of a spaceship. You could sleep in little hammocks, and you could see where the astronauts kept their things. Wow. Katie moved around the spaceship. She climbed through a rounded doorway, and there on the other side was a cockpit. It was full of lights and gadgets and Orby. Katie thought it looked confusing. Orby told her that the astronauts flew the spacecraft from here. He told her he was an astronaut. He was flying Princess Katie to her home planet. They would arrive in 2 years. Katie thought that was a lot of time, but she sat down for the ride. And Dad ducked in behind them and wondered where they were flying to. Katie told him they were flying to her home planet, Earth. Dad smiled proudly at her. He told her she was already becoming a scientist, and she wasn't even trying. Dad asked the 2 friends if maybe they wanted to land at a space station and have a flying saucer burger or a rocket dog. Katie and Orby looked at each other. They were having so much fun they never wanted to stop, but both their tummies were growling. It was a good time for a space stop. That day, they discovered all kinds of things at the Science Museum. And I have to tell you, Katie and Orby agreed that they really wanted to be scientists when they grew up. Dad said that becoming a scientist was something wonderful to think about. And I hope one day you'll be able to visit the Science Museum too. You'll find out about all the things that scientists have been discovering for years. And maybe when you're done, you'll want to become a scientist too. You never know. And I know that you could be an amazing scientist if that's what you really want to do.
Did you know? Some birds and animals have webbed feet. Ducks, geese, and penguins all have webbed feet. Beavers, frogs, and some kinds of dogs have 4 webbed feet. The bits of skin between these animals' toes makes them all very good swimmers.
It had been a day of organizing. Katie took all the shoes that pinched her toes out of her closet and put them in the hand-me-down box. Orby learned that if the blocks on the shelf are stacked according to size, you can see the one you need much easier. And they both found out that there are a lot of old toys in the toy box that they don't play with anymore. Mom told Katie and Orby that the whole house was full of meant-to-dos, and it was the most perfect day to get the meant-to-dos done. Mom's list was much longer than Katie and Orby's, so they were finished long before Mom. As they played tigers in the garden, Mom looked at the very last few things on her list. One was very important. She needed to program 911, an emergency number, into her phone. She did this so if there was ever a big emergency, she could get help right away. Mom put it on the star key, and then she decided to help everybody in the family remember it. She would paint it with bright red nail polish. She found just the right color, put it on, and left it to dry. She planned to tell everybody about the emergency key at dinner. Mom looked at the list again and went on with the last few things. Mom was upstairs going through the bathroom cupboard, and Katie and Orby were in the backyard. They had been crawling around like tigers for a while, and they decided that the tigers were very thirsty. And with that, they crawled into the kitchen looking for something tigery to drink. There was some fruit juice, and after calling up to Mom and asking if they could have some, they managed to pour out 2 glasses. After slurping up their juices like tigers, the 2 friends decided that they would take a tiger snooze on the back porch. They were just heading back outside when Orby noticed the new shiny button on the phone. By this time, the nail polish was dry. It looked shiny and fun to push, so after Katie was out curling up into a snoozing tiger, Orby decided to give it a try. He picked up the receiver and pushed the button. Instantly, there were some beeps and the automatic dial system worked. With huge surprise, Orby found himself talking to someone on the other end. They asked for his address, and he burbled, but they didn't understand. Then they asked for his name. When he burbled this, they told him they would be right there, and Orby looked at the phone in surprise. He hung up and looked around. A moment later, a police car raced up their driveway. Others parked in front of the house on the street. Mom rushed down the stairs calling for Katie and Orby. She was afraid something awful had happened while she was cleaning out the bathroom cupboard. And even a tiger couldn't sleep through all the noise, so Katie rushed in the back door and straight out the front. Mom was hugely relieved to see that Katie and Orby were all right and asked the officer, who was running up the walk from the car, what the problem was. The officer stopped in her tracks. She looked at everybody and said, "Did you not call the emergency number?" Mom was very surprised and explained that they had not called. It wasn't until she turned to look at Orby, who was a little pinker than usual, that she realized that maybe someone did. Mom asked if Orby had pushed the red button, and Orby nodded. Mom apologized and told the police officers that she had just put the emergency number into the phone memory and she hadn't had time to tell the children about it. She said that Orby probably noticed the bright red button and wanted to see what it would do. Orby nodded his head and felt bad. The other officers got back into their cars and drove away, but one officer stayed to talk with Orby and Katie. She told Orby that the others were going to go back and be ready if anyone needed them. She said that the red button was only for a real emergency, that they could help the police do their very best job by not pushing it unless they needed help from the police. That would be perfect. It was there if they needed it, and in times of emergency, it was important to use it. Katie got a little nervous about the emergency part, but the officer told her that probably there wouldn't be an emergency at all, and that was why the button couldn't be played with. Otherwise, all the police might come over to their house when another house might really need them. The police officer smiled at Orby and told him that there was no problem. The button worked, and that was very important. Orby nodded his head again, not feeling too good about the fact that it did. The officer smiled at him and asked him and Katie if they would like to become part of a police protection squad. They didn't know exactly what squad meant, but they both said yes right away. The officer bent down on one knee and told them it was a very serious responsibility. Katie and Orby nodded their heads, listening eagerly. It was a big responsibility to be a squad member. You had to know never ever to push the button unless you needed to. The officer wondered if they could handle it. Mom said that she could take the number out, but the officer said that she would much prefer it if Katie and Orby could be squad members and remember not to play with it. That way, if anything ever did happen, it would be waiting to be used. Orby puffed out his chest and put his arm around his best friend. He proudly told the officer that he and his very best friend, Katie, were old enough and smart enough to know not to play with the button. They would love to join the squad. Well, the officer was delighted, and so was Mom. Then the officer asked them to stand up straight, which they did, and she began to make them squad members. She put her hands on their heads and told them she pronounced them squad members of the very highest order. Katie and Orby giggled. And when the officer left, Mom told Katie and Orby how proud she was. And do you know that you can be a member of the First Order of the Police Protection Squad, too? If you remember not to play with the emergency buttons? And I happen to know that if you can do that, your parents will be very proud of you.
Did you know? Did you know? Did you know? Did you know? Making maps can be fun. Get your crayons and draw maps of your street, your yard, or even your house. But if your room is too messy, you might need a map to find your crayons.
It had been a wild morning. Katie discovered that when you have 4 friends over for a visit, it's hard to make yourself heard. Orby found out that sometimes not everybody wants to play the same game. And they both learned that getting along with everybody at the same time required some thinking. Right before lunch, Andy was running around in circles, shouting and making funny faces. Orby was using Katie's bedspread to make waves on the floor. Bryn and Phoebe were pretending to be turtles. Belkis was playing a kangaroo. Katie was helping Orby by making waves on the other side. Katie pulled and Orby pulled, and by chance, their friends all landed on the bedspread at the same time. There was a terrible rip sound, and everybody stopped moving. They looked down, and there in the middle of the bedspread was a huge rip that zigzagged across it. Everybody stood still for a moment, and they tiptoed off it, and Katie called Mom. When Mom opened the door, she found Katie and Orby still holding the bedspread and feeling very bad. It was almost split in two. Mom looked at the bedspread and then bundled it up on her arm. She told them that there was no use in fixing it. It was damaged beyond repair. The room was full of sad little faces as everybody apologized. Mom smiled and told them that these things happen sometimes. And then she added that it certainly wasn't the end of the world, and everybody felt a bit better. That night when Katie and Orby went to bed, Mom looked at the blanket and told Katie they would have to do something about replacing the bedspread. Katie said that everybody was sorry. No one wanted her to be angry with them. Mom kissed Katie goodnight. She told her that when she was a little girl, she made mistakes too. It was important not to think of it as anything more than that. No one intended to rip the bedspread. The next morning, it was a bright, sunny day. Mom was in the kitchen making a big breakfast for Dad, who'd been working really hard on a project. And they were talking about the bedspread as Katie and Orby walked into the room. Mom turned to Katie and told her that she had an excellent idea. She told them that after lunch, they were to invite their friends back over to help make a new bedspread. Katie and Orby looked at each other. They didn't know how to sew. Mom told them they wouldn't need needles, but it was important to wear old clothes because she had an idea that could be very messy. That afternoon, Mom snuck off shopping, and Dad spent some time in the basement. They were cooking up a surprise, and now that the friends were all here, it was time to start. Everyone was in the backyard waiting. It seemed like an odd place to make a bedspread. Mom came out with a brand new white sheet and 2 pillowcases. Dad came out with ice cream containers full of colorful paint. It was paint they had used to paint Katie's room and other parts of the house, too. Mom draped the big sheet over the hedge so it hung down. She put the pillowcases on the grass. Dad asked everybody to choose a color. There were lots to choose from. When each friend had a container, he told them that they were going to paint the bedspread. Bryn wondered where the brushes were. Mom, who was the designer, said they were going to throw paint on the bedspread. Katie was getting the idea and liking it. She was to go first because, after all, it was her bedspread. Katie had yellow. She thought for a moment. Her friends watched her. They'd never thrown paint at something, and I have to say that everybody was eager to try. Katie lifted up her paint. Mom called out to stand back. Everybody moved out of the way. Katie looked at the middle of the bedspread. She wanted the middle to be bright yellow. She held tight to the container and threw the paint. And she moved it in a sort of circle as the paint shot out. Yellow splatters spiraled into the middle of the sheet, and everybody oohed and awed, and it started to drip down the sheet. Then Dad supervised the painting of the pillowcases. Katie dribbled leftover yellow spirals on the pillowcases, too. And when she was finished, Mom called Orby next. Orby had chosen a kind of pink. That didn't surprise anybody. He held his bucket up, getting ready to throw. He threw his paint in small, short throws. Pink splatters appeared everywhere, little ones, big ones. And when he was finished, everyone told Orby what a good job he had done, and he was delighted. Each friend took a turn, and they had a ball. Mom and Dad did what they called the final touches. That meant that they put color in places that they thought needed it. When everyone had used up all their paint, Dad put the containers away. Then after he'd washed up, he started the barbecue, and he made big, fat hamburgers for all the artists. They sat around the bedspread thinking how splendiferous it was. It dried very quickly in the sun, and soon Mom came out with an indelible marker. Indelible meant it wouldn't wash off. At the bottom of the bedspread, she asked each artist to sign. They took turns putting their names on the bedspread that used to be a plain, ordinary sheet. Katie wanted to put the bedspread on her bed that very night, but Mom told her she was going to wash it a few times first. That kind of paint had fumes, and she needed to make sure that they were gone before the sheet could go on Katie's bed. Everyone was anxious to see how it looked. A few days later, when it was ready, she invited all the artists over to see it. Everybody, Andy, Bryn, Phoebe, Belkis, and Katie and Orby, held their breath as Mom puffed the pillows into the case and then laid the bedspread across the bed. I have to tell you that the friends hugged each other. They were so thrilled. It looked fabulous. Dad came in and piled all the artists on the bed and took a picture. which Katie still has to this day. They had fun turning one thing into something else. They all felt bad about ruining the first bedspread, but delighted to have been part of making the new one. And I hope if you do something you feel bad about, you'll enjoy making it all better, too. Just like Katie and Orby and their friends.